Chapter 1: A Storm at Grayhaven Point. The sea has always had a way of speaking to me. In Cabot Cove, I would often fall asleep to the lull of the waves, comforted by their steady rhythm. But here, on the wild coast of Maine's Grayhaven Point, the Atlantic was no lullaby. The waters roared like a creature unchained, crashing against black cliffs that stood like ramparts against the storm. I had come to Grayhaven for the annual Maritime Literary Festival, a gathering of historians, novelists, and salty sailors eager to trade tales of shipwrecks and wartime legends. It promised to be an invigorating weekend, and I was looking forward to a quiet stretch of writing in my hotel after the lectures. Fate, however, had other plans. That evening, as the first warning gusts of a nor'easter rattled the windows of the inn, I was walking back from a lecture on U-boat warfare when a commotion broke out near the harbour. Lights bobbed on the hillside road leading to the old Grayhaven Lighthouse, a tower that had stood since the early 19th century. Villagers hurried toward it, muffled voices carrying on the wind. The words "keeper" and "dead" reached my ears and drew me forward almost against my will. A mystery, it seemed, had arrived before I had even unpacked my suitcase. By the time I reached the base of the lighthouse, a cluster of anxious faces had gathered. The door stood ajar, and inside I glimpsed the county coroner kneeling beside the slumped figure of Thomas Ridley, the lighthouse keeper. A lifelong mariner, Thomas was well known in the village for his discipline and sobriety. He sat at his desk, head bowed as though in weary slumber, one hand clutching a pencil stub. Before him lay the keeper's Morse code logbook, open to a page scrawled with dots and dashes. A half-finished line trailed off as though broken mid-thought. "Poor Tom," muttered Sheriff Wallace, who had arrived just ahead of me. "Worked himself too hard." Likely his heart gave out. The coroner nodded agreement, but I felt a prickle of doubt. I had known many men and women whose lives had been claimed suddenly, yet something about the scene was wrong. Ridley's chair was positioned neatly, not as if he had fallen back in shock or pain. The pencil lay wedged firmly in his fingers, the final mark sharp rather than shaky. And then there was the matter of the logbook. Why in the dead of night, with a storm howling outside, had Ridley been recording Morse code? I edged closer and studied the page. My days as a school teacher had left me with a love for puzzles, and over the years I had acquired enough skill with codes and ciphers to recognize simple sequences. What I saw was not random scribbling. The message was deliberate, though unfinished. Dots, dashes, pauses, a pattern struggling to reveal itself. I copied the marks into my notebook before the coroner could close the book. Outside, lanterns flickered as villagers whispered in low tones. An elderly woman, frail but sharp-eyed, pressed a shawl tighter around her shoulders and muttered, "He told me he'd found something." He said the light was hiding secrets. Someone shushed her, but I stored the remark carefully in my mind. Secrets have a way of steering the course of human events, as surely as the tides guide a ship. Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat. "Miss Fletcher, I didn't expect to see you mixed up in this." "Don't worry yourself. We'll handle it." I smiled politely, but I've been told my smile at such moments can be rather misleading. "Of course, Sheriff. But you'll forgive me if I remain curious. Old habits die hard." He sighed. "Just don't get in the way of official business." I promised I would not, though both of us knew I rarely kept such promises. Already I felt the familiar stirrings of a case, the puzzle of the Morse code, the improbable neatness of the scene, and the whisper of secrets at the lighthouse. The storm outside seemed to echo my thoughts, booming across the headland like a drumbeat calling me forward. By the time I returned to the inn, rain lashed the windows and lightning etched the harbour in stark flashes. I sat at the small writing desk in my room, the logbooks copied marks before me. Slowly, patiently, I translated the sequence. The beginning was clear enough, 3 letters that spelled out GOL, and then faltered into unfinished strokes. Gold, it was absurd, and yet the word gleamed on the page with stubborn insistence. I thought of the elderly woman's remark about hidden secrets. Could Thomas Ridley have stumbled upon something connected to Grayhaven's wartime history? The innkeeper, Mrs. Caffrey, tapped softly at my door with a tray of tea. She shook her head when I asked about Thomas. "A good man, Miss Fletcher?" "Too good for the way this world treats people. Always kept watch, always alone in that lighthouse. Some say he was chasing ghosts from the war, scribbling in those old logs. But ghosts don't kill a man, not like this." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I set down my teacup and looked once more at the page of code. I have learned that the dead sometimes leave us messages in the most unlikely forms. A footprint in mud, a torn scrap of paper, a careless slip of the tongue. Perhaps this unfinished Morse entry was Thomas Ridley's way of pointing toward the truth, even as death reached for him. The storm outside howled and rattled the shutters, but I felt an even greater storm beginning within. I was not in Grayhaven merely to attend lectures and write essays. A man was dead, and his last words, coded in dots and dashes, were reaching across the veil of silence. Whatever gold meant, treasure, truth, or memory, I intended to find out. I closed my notebook, extinguished the lamp, and listened as the lighthouse beam swept its faithful arc across the sea. Each pulse of light felt like a heartbeat, steady and insistent, whispering that this mystery was only beginning.
Chapter 2, The Keeper's Last Words. Morning broke reluctantly over Grayhaven Point. The storm had blown itself eastward, leaving behind a damp silence that clung to the harbor and the narrow streets like sea fog. Fishermen went about their work with subdued energy, as though the death at the lighthouse had unsettled even the tides. For my part, I found little appetite for breakfast, though Mrs. Caffrey insisted I take an extra scone to keep my strength up for all that writing. I smiled politely, but my notebook that morning held fewer plots for novels and more scribbled theories about Thomas Ridley's final hours. The one person who might shed light on those last hours was Greta Wells, the elderly assistant keeper. Her cottage sat a short walk inland, tucked beneath wind-bent pines. I was told she had worked the light part-time for decades, stepping in when Ridley needed relief. A woman of wartime service, she carried herself with a mixture of discipline and fragility, like a soldier who had never put down her uniform entirely. Greta answered the door wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her eyes bright against her lined face. She recognized me at once. The villagers had been buzzing about my presence, it seemed, and invited me inside with surprising warmth. The sitting room was sparse, yet every surface spoke of the sea, brass compasses, faded naval charts, and a chipped mug bearing the crest of the Women's Royal Naval Service. "I expect you've come about Tom," she said without preamble, lowering herself carefully into a chair. Everyone else seemed satisfied to call it heart failure. "But not you." I admitted that I believed his death held unanswered questions. Greta studied me a long moment, then gave a small, decisive nod. "Good. He deserves someone who'll listen." Tom was troubled, but not careless. He'd been working on something he was certain mattered. She rose and retrieved a small box from a cupboard. Inside lay a stack of old log sheets, meticulously dated, the ink smudged by time and salt. She spread them on the table like a gambler laying down cards. During the war, this coast saw things most folk never knew. Convoys passing under cover of night, enemy subs lurking offshore. I worked signals back then, Morse, ciphers, the lot. Tom believed the Lighthouse archives still held fragments from those days. He said he'd found references to a lost cargo. And then, his last message. Her voice wavered, but she reached into her pocket and handed me a slip of paper. It was a copy she had made of Ridley's final Morse entry, written out neatly. Dash. Dash, slash. Straight face. Dash dot. Even without translation, I recognized the familiar sequence from the night before. I murmured the letters aloud, Joe L.D., Sunken. The word sent a chill through the quiet room. Greta clasped her hands tightly. He wanted me to see it, I think. We'd spoken of it the week before. He said the wartime commanders had hidden a message in the logs, coordinates disguised as weather reports. If the Germans had intercepted it, they'd have thought it nothing more than routine. I leaned back, considering. Wartime secrecy, coded records, whispers of sunken gold, it sounded like the stuff of novels, and yet Greta's conviction was undeniable. Did Tom tell anyone else about this? I asked. Her expression darkened. He mentioned it down at the harbor, too freely if you ask me. Those divers renting boats, they pricked their ears. Men hungry for salvage, not history. He said they'd been watching him. That admission was troubling. Greed has always been a more dangerous tide than any storm. If Thomas Ridley had truly stumbled upon the location of lost bullion, it could explain both his cryptic message and the abrupt end of his life. Before I could press further, a knock sounded at the door. It was Inspector Wallace, looking uncomfortable at finding me in Greta's parlor. He nodded politely but kept his focus on Greta. Miss Wells, we'll need an official statement about your last conversation with Ridley. And as for you, Mrs. Fletcher, I hope you're not encouraging wild stories. Gold at the bottom of the sea? This isn't one of your novels. I resisted the urge to bristle. Perhaps not, Inspector. But sometimes real life takes its cues from fiction. And Mr. Ridley's last written word was very specific. He frowned but chose not to argue. Instead, he asked Greta a few perfunctory questions and then left with a sigh heavy enough to rattle the teacups. Greta watched him go with a mixture of pity and exasperation. You must understand, she said once the door closed, Tom was a man of order. If he wrote something in code, he meant it to be read. He once told me the sea buries nothing forever. Secrets rise like driftwood. Her words resonated with me. I asked if I could borrow the copied sheet of Morse, promising to return it, and she agreed. As I made my way back toward the village, the weight of the message pressed harder upon me. At the inn, I sat down with my notebook and began a fresh translation, letter by letter, testing for variations. One possibility leapt out. The word sunken might not merely describe gold beneath the waves. It could signal a location, shorthand for a documented wreck known locally as the Sunken Star, a freighter lost in 1943. If Ridley had connected the code to that wreck, then Greta's story of hidden coordinates made perfect sense. But why had he written the message at the moment of his death? Had he intended it as a final clue, or had someone forced his hand? The unanswered question needled at me as the inn's grandfather clock ticked on. That evening, the festival resumed, though the mood was subdued. Lecturers spoke of maritime legends, but whispers about Ridley's death carried louder than any lecture. At dinner, I overheard fishermen debating whether divers had bribed Ridley for access. Another swore he had seen lanterns bobbing near the cliffs on nights when tides were at their lowest. Each account added a thread to a growing web. When I finally retired to my room, I laid out the copied Morse message beside my notes. The word gold glared at me like a beacon. Greta had spoken of secrets rising like driftwood. I wondered, was Thomas Ridley's unfinished line not simply a clue, but a warning? If so, then the danger was not in the past but very much in the present. I closed my notebook with a firm snap. Whatever lay beneath the waters of Grayhaven, it had already claimed one life. And if my instincts were correct, it would not be the last, unless I uncovered the truth. Chapter 3, The Maritime Archives. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively calm, as though the storm of the previous days had been only a bad dream. Yet the lighthouse beam, revolving steadily at the edge of the headland, reminded me that reality was much harsher. A man was dead, and his final words hinted at a secret worth killing for. If Greta Wells had given me the thread of a mystery, then the archives would provide the fabric. Grayhaven boasted a modest maritime museum housed in a former customs building by the docks. Its white clapboard walls had weathered a century of salt air, and gulls shrieked overhead as I approached. Inside, the smell of varnished wood mixed with the faint tang of brine. Rows of display cases offered ship's wheels, brass sextants, and weathered life rings, each tagged with a neat brass plaque. The curator, Harold Brenton, greeted me at the door. A tall, scholarly man in his 50s, he had thinning hair and the distracted manner of one forever juggling too many facts. When I introduced myself, he brightened. "Mrs. Fletcher, your books are in our gift shop, Mystery Set in Cabot Cove, yes? A pleasure. Though I dare say you're not here as a tourist." I explained my interest in wartime shipping records, mentioning Thomas Ridley and his sudden death. At the mention of Ridley's name, Harold's eyes flickered, a brief, nervous tick. Then he gestured toward a long oak table. "The archives are yours to peruse. Much of it's mundane, manifests, weather reports, patrol logs. But there are darker chapters. Convoys went down off this coast. Some say carrying bullion for Britain's reserves. A persistent legend, though unsubstantiated." He unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a stack of heavy ledgers, their leather spines cracked with age. As I leafed through the pages, a hush settled over the room. Each entry told a fragment of wartime life. Convoy sighted off Point Grey. Weather, heavy fog. Patrol reports depth charges at 0200 hours. Then, abruptly, entire sections were missing, torn out or crossed through in heavy strokes. I looked up sharply. "This record, who last handled it?" Harold hesitated. "I did, of course. And researchers from the university last spring. The pages were intact then." I pointed to one entry, dated 1943, its lines violently struck out. Yet the ink of the crossing marks was far newer than the rest of the page, less faded, still glossy in the light. Someone had tampered with this record recently. Harold cleared his throat. "Mrs. Fletcher, surely you don't think this connected to poor Ridley's death? He was eccentric. Haunted by ghosts of the war. He came here often, yes, but he believed he had found something," I finished gently. "And from what I see, he wasn't wrong." I copied the relevant entries into my notebook. One referred obliquely to special cargo, diverted under emergency. Another mentioned coordinates disguised for transmission. To a casual reader, they would look like routine notations. To someone like Greta, skilled in wartime codes, they could be far more. Before I left, Harold accompanied me down a row of exhibits. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened the chart. "Mrs. Fletcher, these stories of gold are dangerous. People have drowned chasing less. Ridley was a friend. I warned him not to dig too deep. There was an odd finality in his tone, as though discouragement had crossed into fear. I thanked him and stepped outside into the glaring daylight, my mind whirring. The harbor was alive with activity, fishermen mending nets, tourists snapping photographs of the lighthouse, and, farther out, a small barge bristling with diving gear. Men moved briskly on its deck, too focused to be mere hobbyists. Greta had said salvage crews were sniffing around. Now I saw them with my own eyes. I walked the length of the quay, listening to fragments of conversation. One fisherman muttered about strangers paying good money for night boat rentals. Another mentioned Ridley had been down at the docks the evening before his death, arguing with two divers. Told them they had no business near the shoals, the man said, shaking his head. Next thing you know, he's gone. The implication was clear. If Ridley had indeed discovered the coordinates to a wartime wreck, and if those records had been tampered with, then someone was willing to kill to keep their salvage operation unchallenged. Back at the inn that afternoon, I laid out my notes. The struck-through pages, the Morse message, Greta's testimony, each piece pointed to the same conclusion: Ridley had been silenced because he stood between greed and treasure. Yet I had no proof. Without proof, Inspector Wallace would dismiss my theories as fiction. I needed evidence that could not be brushed aside. That evening, I returned to the archives, claiming I had forgotten my umbrella. Harold, flustered, allowed me in. I moved quickly to the ledgers. There, beneath the struck-through entry, I noticed faint impressions, as though someone had written notes on a sheet laid across the page. Tilting the book toward the light, I discerned the outline of numbers. Coordinates. My pulse quickened. Mrs. Fletcher? Harold's voice startled me. He had returned silently, his expression strained. It's late. Perhaps you should rest. I smiled, closing the book carefully. Of course. Thank you for your help. As I walked back through the dim streets, I could not shake the sense that Harold was more than a nervous curator. He had access to the archives. He knew of Ridley's research. And he had debts. I had overheard as much at supper in the inn. Could desperation have led him to desperate measures? Yet I reminded myself that mysteries seldom yield to the first convenient suspect. Still, as the lighthouse beam swept across the bay, I felt the weight of unfinished business. The archives had confirmed Ridley's suspicions. Somewhere beneath those waves lay a wartime cargo, its value enough to tempt ordinary men into extraordinary crimes. And if Thomas Ridley's last message was to be believed, he had died trying to tell the world exactly where it lay. Chapter 4, Whispers in the Village. Grayhaven Point was one of those places where secrets traveled faster than the tides. By the time I rose the following morning, Thomas Ridley's death had become the only subject of conversation. At breakfast in the inn, I listened as fishermen's wives, festival visitors, and locals alike debated his fate with a kind of morbid energy. Some spoke of heart failure, others of curses, but the consensus was that something about the man's end didn't sit right. I have long believed that gossip, however unreliable, can act like a lantern in the fog, not illuminating the truth directly but revealing shapes and shadows that point to it. And so, after my coffee, I resolved to spend the day walking the village, ears open and notebook ready. The first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Pickering, a formidable woman with a fondness for striped aprons, kept a finger on the pulse of local affairs. She was weighing out sugar for a customer when I entered, but her sharp eyes immediately sought mine. "You'll be wanting to know about poor Tom," she said without prompting. "Good man. Quiet. But he had words with those strangers last week, divers, they were. Not the usual sort we see around here. Kept to themselves. Paid in cash. I told my husband they were up to no good. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Heard them at the post office, asking about old maps. Who does that, if not treasure hunters? I thanked her and moved on, making a mental note. Divers, strangers, maps, each detail added weight to Greta Wells's fears. At the harbor, the talk was different. Men mending nets speculated that Ridley himself had been after gold. Maybe he stumbled on it, one suggested, and someone didn't like him keeping it secret. Another countered that Ridley had been too stubborn for his own good, challenging anyone who came near the shoals. Their voices dropped when I approached, but not before I caught a name repeated twice, Harold Brenton, the archivist. Evidently, his debts were no secret to the fishermen. On Main Street I encountered Reverend Caraway, the parish minister, who stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Mrs. Fletcher, I fear people will make a spectacle of Tom's passing. He was a man of faith, whatever his eccentricities. I would ask you, as a writer, to treat his memory with dignity. I promise you, Reverend, I have no intention of turning this into a story for amusement," I assured him. "I only wish to see justice done." His eyes softened. "Then you should speak with young Colin Shaw. He carries guilt like a stone in his pocket. He may tell you more than he realizes." That suggestion lingered as I continued my walk. By mid-afternoon, I had accumulated a pocketful of whispers, Ridley quarreling at the docks, maps sought by divers, debts owed by Harold, and rumors of Ridley's obsession with wartime codes. Each fragment was like a seashell picked from the sand, incomplete on its own yet hinting at a larger design. I found Colin Shaw near the wharf, seated on a coil of rope, staring at the restless water. His youth set him apart from the hardened fisherman, barely in his 20s, with a face still too open for the cynicism he attempted to wear. When I greeted him, he startled, then forced a smile. "You're Jessica Fletcher. I've read some of your books." "That's kind of you," I replied, sitting beside him. "But I suspect you know more about real mysteries than fictional ones right now." His expression darkened. "If you're asking about Ridley, I didn't touch him. He came down on us hard, said we had no right near the shoals. We told him we were just diving for lobster. He didn't believe us. Said he knew what we were after." "And what were you after?" I asked quietly. Colin shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I'm not proud of it. The others, they talked about wrecks, about wartime gold. I thought it was just stories. But when I saw the way Ridley reacted, maybe it wasn't just talk." He rubbed his hands together nervously. He said Greta had cracked some code. That's why they were watching her, too. That's why I quit. I wanted no part of it. There it was again, Greta's name tied to Ridley's death. A frail old woman, perhaps, but one with the skill to decipher a wartime cipher. Knowledge alone can be as dangerous as gold if the wrong people believe you have it. "Who are the others?" I pressed. Colin shook his head. "I can't. They'll know it was me. Just, watch your back, Mrs. Fletcher." Tom tried to stand in their way, and look what happened. It was a thinly veiled warning, and the fear in his voice told me more than names could. I thanked him and left him staring out at the water, his conscience clearly at war with his fear. By the time evening fell, the festival resumed with another round of lectures, but the talk among villagers was less about literature and more about treasure. At supper in the inn, a table of locals argued openly about whether the government would seize any bullion if it were found. One man insisted the Navy had already recovered it decades ago, another swore the wreck remained untouched, guarded by storms and fate. Mrs. Caffrey leaned close to me as she served pie. "You see how it is, Miss Fletcher. Gold fever. It gets into people's blood, even when it's just rumor. Tom's death will only fan the flames. Mark my words, someone else will pay the price if this doesn't stop." I could not disagree. The whispers I had gathered were no longer harmless gossip. They painted a picture of a community poised on the edge of greed and fear. Somewhere among them, truth was waiting, and truth, I knew, was rarely whispered. It was hidden, silenced, or struck out in ink like the entries in Harold Brenton's ledger. As I returned to my room that night, the lighthouse beam swept across the darkened village. Each pass of its light seemed to illuminate a different face in my mind: Greta's lined determination, Harold's nervous hands, Colin's guilty eyes. They were pieces of a puzzle I was still fitting together, but one thing was certain: Thomas Ridley had not died alone. His final words, scribbled in code, had begun a conversation the whole village was now unwillingly part of. And I intended to hear every whisper until the truth spoke loud enough for all to hear. Chapter 5: The Diver's Confession. The morning after my rounds through the village, Grayhaven Point seemed wrapped in a peculiar stillness. The fishermen launched their boats without their usual banter, and shopkeepers opened shutters with distracted expressions. The death of Thomas Ridley had left the air heavy, as though the lighthouse itself were brooding over the town. I intended to spend the day sorting my notes, but fate had other ideas. As I passed the harbor, I spotted Colin Shaw again. He was limping along the pier, a fresh bruise swelling along his jaw. Clearly, someone had taken exception to his loose tongue. He tried to wave me off when I approached, but I would not be deterred. "Colin," I said gently, "whoever did that to you doesn't want you speaking. That alone tells me you know something important. If you truly wish to honor Thomas Ridley, you must tell the truth." He looked at me with haunted eyes, then lowered himself onto a bench. His shoulders sagged as if the fight had gone out of him. "I didn't want to be part of it. I swear, Mrs. Fletcher. I thought it was just stories, old wrecks, nothing more. But they brought me in because I could handle the gear. I didn't know it would come to this." "Start from the beginning," I encouraged. Colin took a shaky breath. "There are 4 of them. They call themselves a salvage crew, but they're just treasure hunters. They rented a barge, said they had charts, coordinates, everything. At first, I thought it was legal. Then I realized they were hiding things, paying in cash, moving only at night. Ridley figured out what they were doing. He told them straight to their faces they had no right near the shoals." I nodded. "And that was when you saw tempers flare?" "Worse," Colin whispered. "One of them, a man named Pike, said Ridley would be easier to deal with once he stopped talking. The others laughed, but not in a joking way. When Ridley turned up dead the next night, I knew. I knew." His voice broke. I placed a hand on his arm. "Did you go to the police?" He shook his head violently. "You don't understand. Pike's dangerous. He's been in trouble before. If I tell Wallace, he'll know it was me. I've already been warned." He touched his bruised jaw. "This is their way of saying keep quiet." My heart went out to the young man, caught in a net he had neither woven nor deserved. Yet his information was vital. "Colin," Ridley left a final message, a Morse code entry pointing to sunken gold. Do you know if the crew learned of it? Colin swallowed. Yes. Pike said Ridley had cracked something with Greta's help. They thought if they leaned on her, she'd give them the coordinates. But Greta's tougher than she looks. She kept quiet. I felt a chill. Greta Wells, frail though she was, might be in danger even now. I resolved to visit her again before dusk. Before I left the harbor, I studied the barge anchored beyond the quay. Men moved about on deck, their voices carrying faintly across the water. Equipment gleamed in the sunlight, air tanks, ropes, metal detectors. Whatever else they were prepared. It was not the kit of hobby divers but of professionals on a hunt. Back at the inn, Inspector Wallace was finishing his lunch. I slid into the seat opposite him. He looked weary, his tie loosened. "You've been talking to half the town, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "They say you've stirred up Ridley's ghost more than a preacher stirs a congregation." "I've been listening," I corrected. "And what I hear suggests Ridley's death was no accident. I have reason to believe a salvage crew threatened him. One of their men, Colin Shaw, is terrified, but he's given me enough to know they're after the wartime wreck." Wallace leaned back, skeptical as always. "Rumors. I can't drag men into custody on gossip." "Then look at their barge," I urged. "They're outfitted for deep salvage, not lobster diving. And Ridley's Morse code log ends with a message about gold. Isn't that enough to merit investigation?" He frowned, drumming his fingers. "Maybe. But I'll need more than your instincts to make a case stick. Keep your nose clean, Mrs. Fletcher. Leave this to the law." I gave him a smile that said I would do no such thing. That evening I climbed the path to Greta Wells's cottage. She welcomed me in, though fatigue showed in her every movement. I told her of Colin's warning. Her lips tightened. "They won't get anything from me. I've lived through worse than threats." Even so, I urged her to stay with a neighbor for safety. She refused, insisting the lighthouse needed tending. Her stubbornness worried me, but I could not force her hand. As night fell, I returned toward the inn. The harbor lay quiet under a rising moon. Yet far out near the shoals, I spotted faint lights bobbing on the water, lanterns or electric lamps from the salvage barge. Men were already diving under cover of darkness. Colin's confession echoed in my mind. Pike and his crew would stop at nothing. Ridley had stood against them and lost his life. Greta might be next. And unless I could bring the truth to light, the storm of greed would claim more victims before the tide turned. I paused at the edge of the quay, the salt wind sharp against my face. Somewhere beneath those waves, bullion from a vanished freighter still glittered in the dark. Above them, men plotted to seize it, even at the cost of murder. And here I was, with only a notebook and determination, facing a battle as old as time, justice against greed. I squared my shoulders. Thomas Ridley's last message had not been in vain. I would see it carried forward, dot by dot, dash by dash, until the full truth emerged. Chapter 6, Secrets Beneath the Waves. The following day dawned with skies washed clean after the storm. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the hush that seemed to hang over Grayhaven Point. The lighthouse stood sentinel at the edge of the headland, its white tower gleaming in the sunlight. Yet for all its serenity, I felt unease stirring within me. The sea had secrets, and men were willing to kill to claim them. I decided my first call must be to Greta Wells. The divers had spoken her name too often for comfort, and I feared she might already have been pressured for whatever knowledge she held. Her cottage door opened after my first knock, and she appeared in the doorway, thinner and paler than I remembered, though her eyes were still fierce. "You've heard the talk," she said before I could speak. "They've been sniffing around again. Left a note on my gate last night, nothing but the word coordinates." She handed me the scrap of paper, her hands trembling slightly. "As if I'd hand over what they want." I urged her to sit, and together we spread her papers across the table once more. She had spent years studying Ridley's findings, cross-checking them against the wartime logs. "He was right," she whispered. "The weather reports, they weren't just about storms. Each one matched to a grid reference. A code layered under the ordinary." She guided my hand across the faded ink. February 1943, gales, heavy seas. April, visibility poor. Yet beside each entry, almost invisible, tiny notations in shorthand, numbers and letters. Greta had been patient, extracting the pattern piece by piece. When combined, they formed a map. My heart quickened as she revealed a rough sketch of the coastline, marked with a cross not far from the shoals. "That's where the freighter went down," she said. "The sunken star. And if the legend's true, that's where the bullion lies still." The gravity of it sank in. The code wasn't fantasy, not wishful thinking on Ridley's part. It was deliberate, clever, and utterly convincing. He had died with proof of its reality, and Greta now carried the torch. "Greta, you mustn't keep this here," I cautioned. "If Pike or the others discover you have this map, they'll do more than leave notes. We must get this to Inspector Wallace." She shook her head stubbornly. "And have it locked in some government vault?" Tom wanted the truth known. He wanted history to speak. Not buried under red tape. I admired her spirit but knew the danger was real. Before I could persuade her further, a knock rattled the door. Greta stiffened. I signaled for her to stay seated and opened it myself. A boy stood on the stoop, holding a parcel. "For Miss Wells," he muttered, then hurried away. We opened it cautiously. Inside lay a stone wrapped in cloth. On the cloth, scrawled in crude letters, were the words, "Stay silent or join him." Greta's face blanched. I folded the cloth carefully and tucked it into my bag. This has gone far enough. If they think threats will silence us, they've miscalculated. That afternoon, I went to the cliffs above the shoals. The tide was at its lowest, the rocks jutting out like the spine of some ancient beast. Through binoculars, I could see Pike's barge anchored close, men preparing to dive. Ropes coiled on deck, tanks gleamed in the sunlight, and one man stood apart, Pike himself, broad-shouldered, his stance unmistakably that of a bully accustomed to obedience. I lingered at the cliff's edge, making notes. Then I noticed something else, a second, smaller boat slipping out from the harbor, hugging the coastline. It carried Harold Brenton, the archivist. Even from a distance, I recognized his angular frame and hunched posture. He was bringing supplies to Pike's crew, his complicity plain. The pieces were clicking into place. Harold's debts, his access to the altered records, his presence on the barge, all of it pointed to him as their inside man. But still the question lingered, had he struck the fatal blow against Ridley, or merely paved the way for others? That evening, I returned to the inn, only to find Inspector Wallace waiting for me in the lounge. He looked tired, but his eyes sharpened when he saw me. "Mrs. Fletcher, you've been watching the barge. Don't deny it. Word travels." "I won't deny it," I replied calmly. "And I'll tell you this, the men on that barge are not after lobsters. They are stripping our history bare, and they killed a man to protect their claim. I laid the cloth-wrapped stone before him. This was delivered to Greta Wells today. A threat. How much longer will you wait before you act? Wallace studied the cloth, his jaw tightening. This changes things. I'll put men on Greta's cottage tonight. But as for the barge, I need ironclad evidence before I can move. I left him with the stone, but unease gnawed at me. Evidence was mounting, but proof remained elusive. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered the headland paths. The sea was restless, the lighthouse beam sweeping in steady arcs. Far out on the water, lanterns glowed once more from the barge. Divers slipped into the waves, their silhouettes vanishing beneath. I closed my eyes and imagined what lay below, the sunken star, resting in darkness, its cargo gleaming like temptation itself. Around it, men swam with greedy purpose, blind to the dangers of both the sea and their own consciences. And above, on the cliffs, one woman with a notebook stood against them. I knew the tide of greed would not ebb willingly. But I also knew Thomas Ridley's final message had lit a path, and I meant to follow it, wherever it led, even beneath the waves. Chapter 7, The Tide of Fortune. The next morning broke gray and unsettled, as though the sea itself anticipated confrontation. From my window at the inn I could see Pike's barge still anchored off the shoals, a dark blot against the restless water. Its crew worked with grim efficiency, hoisting equipment and lowering nets. Whatever they had retrieved in the night, they intended to bring ashore soon. I knew we were running out of time. Greta's life was in danger, and Inspector Wallace still hesitated, wary of moving without irrefutable evidence. Yet if the barge landed its cargo, not only would proof vanish but so too might any chance of justice for Thomas Ridley. I decided to press matters myself. Armed with Greta's copied map and the threatening cloth, I requested a meeting with Wallace at the constable's office. He listened with arms crossed, his expression guarded. "You're asking me to arrest men for diving in open waters," he said flatly. "Even if they are after salvage, that's not a crime in itself." "But murder is," I countered. "And Ridley died because he threatened their plans." Colin Shaw overheard Pike discussing it. "Greta has been threatened. Harold Brenton altered the archives to conceal the wreck's true location. How much more must happen before you see the pattern?" Wallace sighed and rubbed his temples. "You make it sound neat, Mrs. Fletcher. But in a courtroom, neat isn't enough. It has to be watertight." I smiled wryly. "Then let's provide the tide to carry it in." That afternoon, I sought out Harold Brenton at the museum. He looked gaunt, his hands trembling as he straightened display cases that needed no attention. When I mentioned Pike, his composure cracked. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They promised me a share. Enough to clear every debt, enough to start fresh. I never wanted bloodshed." "But there was bloodshed," I reminded him gently. "Ridley is dead. Greta is in danger. Do you really believe Pike will leave you alive once you've outlived your usefulness?" Harold sagged into a chair. His eyes darted about, like a trapped animal seeking escape. I didn't strike him. I swear it. Pike did. Ridley threatened to expose us, so Pike lashed out. I thought it was just a blow, but when we left him slumped at that desk, I knew. Pike said to leave the log open, make it look natural. I couldn't stop him. The words spilled out like a confession carried on a desperate tide. I urged Harold to tell Inspector Wallace, but he shook his head. Pike would kill me before I reached the station. "No, Mrs. Fletcher, you're clever. You'll find a way to trap him. As I left the museum, I considered my options. Harold's testimony, though powerful, was only words unless Pike incriminated himself. We needed a plan. By evening, Wallace reluctantly agreed to set a watch on the harbor. Greta was persuaded, finally, to spend the night under protection at a neighbor's home. That left me free to observe the barge. At dusk, Colin Shaw appeared again, his face pale but determined. "I can't stand by any more," he said. "They're bringing something up tonight. If you want proof, this is the time." Together we crept along the headland until the barge lay in view. Lanterns glowed on its deck. We watched as Pike and two others hauled up a net glistening with seawater. Within it was a crate, its wood blackened with age. Even from a distance I felt a shiver, the past rising from the depths. The men pried it open. Gold bars, unmistakable even in dim light, caught the lantern glow. Pike laughed harshly, his voice carrying across the water. "Enough to buy our way clear." And Ridley thought he could stop us. That was all the evidence we needed. I signaled to Wallace's men, stationed below on the quay. They moved swiftly, boats cutting across the waves toward the barge. For a moment Pike and his crew tried to scatter, but the tide was against them. The law had finally turned. Back on shore, Pike was dragged into custody, still shouting threats. Wallace, shaken but resolute, turned to me. "You were right, Mrs. Fletcher. Ridley died for standing against them. Now his message has brought them down." I nodded, though my heart was heavy. Greed had twisted ordinary men into murderers, and no amount of recovered treasure could wash away that stain. Later, in the quiet of the inn, I opened my notebook once more. I copied the final dots and dashes of Ridley's message, finishing the word he had begun, gold. It was not the gold itself that mattered, but the truth it illuminated. His last act had been to leave a code that, when read, ensured his killers would not escape justice. The tide of fortune had turned indeed. Not toward wealth, but toward truth. Chapter 8, Jessica's Reflection. The day after Pike and his men were arrested, Grayhaven Point felt as though it had shed a weight it hadn't known it carried. The gulls wheeled above the harbor with renewed vigor, and children dared once more to skip stones along the quay. But beneath the calm surface, the village hummed with unease. It isn't every day that neighbors discover a fortune in gold had lain within reach, nor that murder had been committed to claim it. Inspector Wallace spent much of the morning in his office, processing statements. I joined him briefly to deliver my own testimony. Pike remained unrepentant, glowering from his cell, his threats echoing down the corridor. His crew, however, had broken quickly. Under questioning, they admitted to diving at night, to bribing Harold Brenton, and to covering for Pike after Ridley's death. Harold himself was a pitiful sight. He sat hunched at a desk, hands clasped, repeating over and over that he had never meant for anyone to die. His debts, his desperation, his weak will, all had led him to betrayal. When I left the office, I found myself reflecting on how greed rarely arrives in thunderclaps. More often it seeps in quietly, as a trickle through a crack, until it undermines the entire structure of a life. Greta Wells was waiting for me at the inn, wrapped in her cardigan, but with color back in her cheeks. She took my hand in both of hers. "Tom would thank you," she said simply. "He wanted the truth to outlive him. You made sure it did." I shook my head. It was his determination, not mine, that wrote the ending. He left his message in the only language he trusted, dots and dashes. My part was only to read it. She smiled faintly. Funny, isn't it? We spent the war tapping out codes to protect secrets. And now a code has exposed them. That afternoon, the crate of gold was transported under armed escort to a naval facility. Officially, it would be catalogued and likely absorbed into government holdings. Unofficially, whispers swirled through Grayhaven. Some believed more treasure remained on the seabed, others claimed the government would conceal the true amount recovered. I knew better than to argue. Villages thrive on stories, and Grayhaven had found itself a legend to last another century. At the closing ceremony of the Maritime Literary Festival, the tone was subdued. Lecturers who had come to speak on folklore and history instead offered solemn remarks about the line between myth and fact, greed and honor. I was asked, reluctantly, to give a few words. I stood at the podium, looking out over the townsfolk, the visitors, and the journalists who had arrived overnight. Thomas Ridley, I began, was a man who believed the past speaks if we are willing to listen. He tended a lighthouse, guiding ships through storms, but he also tended the fragile light of truth. In the end, he paid with his life for refusing to let that truth be extinguished. Let us remember him not as a keeper of a tower, but as a keeper of integrity. Applause followed, polite but heartfelt. Greta's eyes shone with tears. That evening, as I packed my suitcase, Mrs. Caffrey brought me a slice of pie for the road. She lingered in the doorway. You've given this town more than you know, Miss Fletcher. Not just answers, but the courage to face them. We'll remember. I thanked her and finished my packing. Yet before leaving, I felt drawn once more to the cliffs. The lighthouse beam cut through the twilight, steady and sure. Below, the waves surged and broke, as they had for centuries, indifferent to the fortunes and failings of men. Somewhere beneath, the wreck of the sunken star still lay, its secrets no longer hidden but forever part of Grayhaven's story. I opened my notebook and wrote a final entry. The sea buries many things, ships, cargo, even lives. But it does not bury truth forever. Truth rises, carried on tides, revealed in codes, whispered in the voices of those brave enough to pass it on. Thomas Ridley's light will shine as long as men value justice over greed. Closing the notebook, I let the wind lift a strand of hair across my face. The gulls cried overhead. The beam swept once more. My train left at dawn, carrying me back toward Cabot Cove and the quiet comfort of home. But even as the coastline receded from view, I felt the echo of Grayhaven Point in my heart, a place where the past surfaced through storm and silence, and where one man's last words, scrawled in Morse code, had guided justice safely to shore.